Good evening. Welcome to the final event of the 2011-2012 Arts and Humanities Dean's Lecture Series. I am Bonnie Thornton Dill, Dean of the College of Arts and Humanities, and I want those of you who are here with us and those who are watching online to know how pleased we are that you have chosen to join us this evening. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, the Stamp Student Union, the Departments of Women's Studies, American Studies, Philosophy, the Office of the Chief Diversity Officer, and the Advanced Program. A lot of people wanted to co-sponsor Angela Davis. Now in its second year, our series provides an opportunity for the college faculty, students, and staff to join together with friends and colleagues in both our on- and off-campus community for stimulating conversations about issues that illuminate the breadth, depth, and importance of arts and humanities, past and present. Lectures and performances in the series address either enduring or emerging questions central to the arts and humanities, or questions arising from other disciplines or the public to which the arts and humanities might speak. In addition to presenting a major public event, each guest interacts in smaller settings with faculty, graduate students, and/or undergraduates. It's been an exciting year of speakers, to say the least. From a dynamic conversation about the creative process with Tony Award winner and Kennedy Center honoree choreographer Bill T. Jones, to riveting talks on language and politics by world-renowned linguist and social critic Noam Chomsky, and then to a frank discussion of the gritty, passionate work of Emmy Award-winning writer, producer of HBO's The Wire, and UM alum David Simon, to this evening's guest, Angela Davis, about whom I'll say more in just a minute. I'm going to give you lots of... We're excited. In our teaching, learning, research, and service in the College of Arts and Humanities, we aim to understand the people, cultures, and histories of our increasingly global society, and to broaden our wisdom about how to live a meaningful life amidst the rich diversity of this world. Our goal for the students, faculty, and staff in the College of Arts and Humanities is, simply put, to be world-wise. So I invite you to join the Be World-Wise conversation and share your suggestions and thoughts on our booklet and continuing lecture series by visiting www.beworldwise.umd.edu. And for those of you who are tweeting this evening, please use hashtag UMDDLS. Did I say that right, Nikki? Okay. So now we turn to the substance of the evening. And I am particularly pleased and honored to introduce our esteemed guest, Angela Yvonne Davis. I am of the generation of Black American women who, in the late summer and early fall of 1970, moved cautiously through many public spaces, sensing that with our brown skins and large afros, we were likely under surveillance because we were thought to look like Angela Davis. Miss Davis had been placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list on false charges and was the subject of an intense police search that drove her underground and culminated in one of the most famous trials in recent U.S. history. Later, and late one night, I stood with others outside the Women's House of Detention in New York City when Angela was found, arrested, and detained there. And I was at the rally in Madison Square Garden with thousands of others when she was released and vindicated. So it has been a personal pleasure to have known her first as a cultural icon, later as a scholar, and more recently as a colleague. Through her political activism that began when she was a child in Birmingham, Alabama, and continued during her high school years in New York, and through her scholarship over the last decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in our nation's quest for social justice. Her work as an educator, both university level and in the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Her teaching career has taken her to San Francisco State University, Mills College in Oakland, California, and the University of California, Berkeley. She has also taught at UCLA, Vassar, the Claremont Colleges, and Stanford University. She spent the last 15 years at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where she is now Distinguished Professor Emerita of History of Consciousness, an interdisciplinary PhD program, and of Feminist Studies. Professor Davis's scholarship has been foundational in the fields of African American and women's studies. One of her most widely cited early articles was written when she was in prison and focused on black women's role in the community of slaves. She is the author now of 8 books and has lectured throughout the United States as well as in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. In recent years, a persistent theme of her work has been the range of social problems associated with incarceration and the generalized criminalization of those communities that are most affected by poverty and racial discrimination. She draws upon her own experiences of 18 months in jail and on trial, and from extensive research conducted on numerous issues related to race, gender, and imprisonment. Described as showcasing her brilliance, grace, and radical audacity, her most recent books are Abolition, Democracy, and Are Prisons Obsolete?, both about the abolition of the prison industrial complex. She has also produced a new critical edition of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, which some of you who have been around here for a while may remember was a first-year book at Maryland in 1994. Angela Davis is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. Like many other educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to educational institutions. Having helped to popularize the notion of the prison industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons and to help forge a 21st century abolitionist movement. In her career, Angela Davis has been an academic, activist, scholar, and revolutionary. She has been brave enough to speak out when others were silent, bold enough to stand when others feared sitting, and sometimes, some might say, brilliantly foolish enough to venture where even angels fear to tread. She has always done this in community, in collaboration with others, and in the interests of improving the conditions of the oppressed. In doing so, she continues to challenge us individually and as a society to think new thoughts and imagine the unimaginable. So it is with great pleasure that I present to you tonight Professor Angela Davis.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, first, I asked a few minutes ago that the house lights be brought up, and I think the understanding must have been that I wanted brighter lights shining on me. Because I would really like to see you this evening. Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a bit better. And these lights are pretty bright here. And another housekeeping question. Do I really have to use this lavalier microphone? No? Okay, good. Great. Okay. Now we can get started. First, let me begin with a formal acknowledgement of the original inhabitants of the land on which we gather this evening. Let us never forget the genocidal violence inflicted on indigenous people by the process of colonization. The mandate to remember is also a mandate to work in solidarity with Native American struggles today. Now, it seems as if the room is still quite dark. Is there... Oh, okay. Well, I think it may be these lights here. If you could... We need to see each other. Okay, that is a lot better. Thank you very much. And so now let me thank Bonnie Thornton Dill for the wonderful introduction and for having invited me to participate in this lecture series of the arts and humanities. And of course, I could say a great deal about Bonnie Thornton Dill, whose work I have been following for many decades. Perhaps I shouldn't say exactly how long, but I do want to say that you are indeed fortunate to have her on this campus. Her pioneering work has helped to transform the field of feminist studies, and she is now doing an amazing job as president of the National Women's Studies Association. So let us acknowledge Bonnie. And looking out into the audience, I see Mary Helen Washington, whom I haven't seen in a long time. So I'd like to do a brief shout out to Mary Helen, whose work also helped to transform many fields, including the field of feminist studies. Now, I want to begin by asking you whether you read the New York Times on Sunday. Did anybody? Did you see the editorial page? Okay, well, you know, I still have a subscription to the New York Times. I actually receive the paper every day. Sometimes I do read it on my iPad, but on the editorial page of the New York Times this past Sunday was a photograph of a piece of street art in Santa Monica, California. That image depicted a light-colored sweatshirt with a red bag of Skittles protruding from one of the pockets of the sweatshirt. And drawn on the front was a large red target. And no, it was not about the retail store Target, but a similar red target. And let me say that here we are in the spring of 2012, and all over the country and throughout the world, we're focused on this persistence of racism, and largely because the recent murder of Trayvon Martin has reminded us that we have not come nearly as far as it has been assumed. In the 20th century, and soon there will be those who will not remember the 20th century, but in the 20th century, mid-20th century freedom movement, participants in that liberation struggle sang a song called "Freedom is a Constant Struggle," and they say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. They say that freedom is a constant struggle. Oh Lord, we've struggled so long. We must be free. We must be free. But of course, this last line was steeped in irony, because they knew when they sang this song that they were not free, and that they would have to continue to struggle, that they would have to constantly struggle. At the age of 17, Trayvon Martin learned, and this was the last lesson of his far too young life, he learned that racism still infects the thoughts and emotions of many people in the U.S., and that racism can express itself through ravaging violence. Trayvon has become so familiar to all of us, right? That we think of him as our brother, as our son, grandson, boyfriend, cousin, friend. And we all know the story. He casually walked back from a convenience store to the home of his father's fiancée in a gated community in Sanford, Florida, with nothing more than Skittles purchased for the son of his father's fiancée and the can of iced tea, never realizing that he would lose his life because he was young and black, and maybe also because he pulled a hoodie over his head to protect himself from the drizzle that night. Brent Staples wrote the op-ed piece that accompanied the image of the sweatshirt I described. And I'd like to share with you a passage from that article, which was entitled Young Black Male and Stalked by Bias. The door to the subway train slides open, revealing 3 tall, young black men. Of course, this is New York, right? And so I am assuming that most of you are familiar with the scene of the subway in New York. The door to the subway train slides open, revealing 3 tall young black men crowding the entrance with hooded sweatshirts pulled over downward-turned faces, boxer shorts billowing out of overlarge, low-slung jeans, and sneakers with the laces untied. Your response to the look and to this trio on the subway depends in part on the context, like the time of day, but especially how you feel about young male blackness. If it unsettles you, as it does many people, including black people, that's my parenthetical observation. If it unsettles you, as it does many people, you never go beyond the first impression. But those of you who are not reflexively uncomfortable with blackness can discern the clues that tell who these kids are. They may be tall, but their hormonally pockmarked faces, narrow hips, and the cartoon-patterned underwear show that they are probably 15 years old at most. The grimy black book bags, barely visible against the black hoodies, make them students on the way to school. And he continues, I would urge you to do a search and find that editorial. I was actually quite impressed that this was the main editorial in the New York Times, and the Sunday Times at that. And I want to ask the question, have we engaged in struggles against racism for all of these decades, for centuries, at least 2 centuries, in order to arrive in the 21st century where, under a black president, parents must warn black sons to beware of those who are ideologically programmed to perceive them as criminals. And so parents often have that talk with adolescent black boys. And the talk, which is usually referred to, is not the talk about sexuality, which girls and boys of all racial and ethnic backgrounds receive at about, 11 or 12 or so, or maybe younger. It's younger now. It's like 9 or 10, isn't it? I remember when I got that talk. But this talk is about the police. This is the talk about how to act when you're stopped by the police. And usually it's black boys and Latino boys who are the ones who get to hear that talk. And they learn that black masculinities have been so thoroughly criminalized that they cannot escape the grip of that criminalization. And what is so ironic is that more boys who are potential targets of the police are talked to about this racism and this potential for violence and this criminalization process than are police, who end up being the ones stopping them. Who talks to them? Why must those who suffer from the persistence of racism be held responsible, basically, for the behavior of the potential perpetrators of racism? I want to talk a little bit about this criminalization process. And I want to talk about all of the various connections that require us to be attentive not only to race, but also to gender, and that require us to understand the centrality of the criminal justice system in our lives, the centrality of this institution of the prison, and then I want to talk a little bit perhaps about how to challenge it and what prison abolition might mean in the 21st century. And I apologize, I still have a little cold, so I'm drinking my ginger tea. And if I have to stop to blow my nose, I really apologize in advance. But I would like to say a few words about the tendency to individualize such incidents as the one involving Trayvon Martin. And of course we're all seduced by the media coverage, and we also all want to know. We want to know every single fact. We want to know everything that there is to know about George Zimmerman and what happened that night. We want to know all of the evidence that will be deployed in the context of the legal trial. And at the same time, we don't want to know the larger context. We don't want to acknowledge that this has been going on for decades and centuries, and it happens all the time. There is nothing really exceptional about what happened to Trayvon Martin, yet we exceptionalize it and treat it as if it could be understood by simply gathering all of the facts around that particular incident. And I think that that is a very dangerous mode of perception, because we then begin to assume that the problem can be solved by bringing the perpetrator to justice. And I'm sorry, I forgot to set my timer. I've been speaking, what, for about 10 minutes? About 10 minutes? 5? Okay, I'll put it on for 35 more minutes then. and giving myself an extra 5 minutes at the end. Yeah, we assume that we can solve this problem simply by bringing George Zimmerman to justice. And of course he should be held accountable. Of course he should be held accountable. But holding George Zimmerman accountable is not going to purge the country of this violent criminalization process that has already claimed so many lives. And I'll just say parenthetically, we tend to replicate a criminal justice system that is founded on retribution and vengeance within our own emotional constitution. So we tend to assume that the only way to address harm is by harming the person who created the harm, and thereby creating a cycle, which means that the violence will continue indefinitely. And just parenthetically, I'll tell you that during the Truth and Reconciliation hearings in South Africa, there was an older black woman whose husband and sons were killed. And she went before the Truth and Reconciliation, participated in that process, and confronted the white man, I think he was either soldier or a cop, soldier or a policeman, who was responsible for killing her husband and sons. And she was asked what she wanted to happen to this man. And she looked at him and she said, "You have taken my husband, my sons, I have no one left. I want you to come to my house every day and be my companion." And she said this from her heart. And I evoke this because I think that we should also, as we attempt to arrive at solutions, we should imagine different kinds of justice. And having said this, I want to point out that struggles for liberation have always been collective struggles. We act as if it were all about individuals now, but it has always been about communities. Individuals have benefited, but struggles are not so much about individuals as about collectivities and communities. And so how do we dialectically negotiate the contradictions that inevitably characterize the way individuals benefit from collective struggles? During an earlier era, activists emphasized the importance of giving back. When an individual benefits from a struggle that has involved the community, she or he was always expected to help preserve that ongoing struggle, to give back. Individual victories were never seen as the final goals of these struggles. And so recently, I've been sharing my mother's story. My mother passed a few years ago, and of course it's usually only after someone is no longer with us that we understand, that we attempt to understand the meaning of their lives. And I should say that my mother was an activist. She was involved in the Southern Negro Youth Congress. She was involved in the NAACP, which was, at that time in the South, was like being a member of the Communist Party, right, which I later became a member of. But my mother was a foster child in rural Alabama who grew up with foster parents who didn't think that education was that important. And so she was not encouraged by her parents to get an education. As a matter of fact, they assumed that when she graduated from elementary school, that would be it. She would get a job like everyone else. But what my mother did was, and it's a long, complicated story, but she basically ran away from home and moved from Sylacauga, Alabama to Birmingham, which was a big city, and cleaned houses to make money, and got a room at the YWCA so she could go to high school. And then, of course, eventually she went to college and she went to graduate school and became a reading specialist. And my mother could teach anyone how to read. And I thought it was just natural and normal back then because we had to start reading when we were 2. By the time we were 3, we were reading books. My siblings and I. But what I realize now is with all of the discourses around reading disabilities and so forth, there was not one student that my mother was not able to teach how to read. This was prior to all of these diagnoses, and she had a little trailer outside of the school where she taught, Wilkinson, and her role was to teach the kids who could not learn in regular classes. And she taught every single child who was brought to her how to read. And we didn't know a lot of this until her memorial, when a lot of those students showed up at the memorial and said that she had absolutely transformed their lives. Now, I'm talking about giving back. She gave back. She was helped. She was helped by many people in the community, by the principal and teachers who encouraged her to go to college, and she got scholarships and so forth. And so she always emphasized that it was our responsibility to give back to the community. And sometimes it's hard to grasp this relationship between the individual and the collective because it really militates against the common sense ideas with which we function. We think of individuals in capitalist democracies, capitalist so-called democracies. I like the term bourgeois democracy, which I've been saying more in the aftermath of Occupy, which has made it possible for us to discuss capitalism in a way that perhaps has not happened since the 1930s. So we should, if the Occupy movement did nothing else, it created the space for us to have discussions about what is really wrong with the world today and what has been wrong for a very long time. And that's capitalism. But I want to go back to the story of Trayvon Martin and our tendency to assume that it is only about individuals and that the solution is an individual solution. How is it that we know and we can name people whose lives have been claimed by police violence? I mean, we know about Oscar Grant, who died 3 years ago in Oakland, California. We know about Abner Louima in New York, right, who was beaten and tortured and sodomized by New York City police officers. We know about Rodney King. We saw the video. Some of us also know about Taisha Miller in Riverside, California, and Robert Rusk and LaTanya Haggerty. Women are not immune either. We know about Sean Bell, who was killed just before his wedding was to take place in 2006. And some of us If we've been involved in the immigrant rights movement, may know about a 15-year-old Mexican citizen named Sergio Adrian Hernandez Huereca, who was shot to death by a Border Patrol agent in June of 2010 near the El Paso Juarez port of entry. He was apparently hanging out with a group of his friends when the Border Patrol agents began firing at him and others near him. Their rationale was that someone was throwing rocks at them while they were trying to detain a few, they say, illegal immigrants who were fleeing back into Mexico. And of course, illegal is a term we should excise from our vocabulary when it is connected with human beings. No human being is illegal. Sergio was shot in the head and he died instantly. And he had apparently never crossed into U.S. territory. And of course, there are many, many examples. There's the example of James Anderson in Jackson, Mississippi. And some of you know about that case where 7 white teenagers decided to go to Jackson to look for a black person to harass. And they ended up running him down with a pickup truck, recapitulating the James Byrd case in Texas, right? And as it turns out, the white kid driving the pickup truck just pled guilty. So he was sentenced to life. And so what is that going to do? There will be many more James Andersons, just as that case was preceded by James Byrd so many years ago. And there's that case of Kenneth Chamberlain in New York, an older black man, a veteran, I think he was a Vietnam veteran, who had a medical device that dialed 911, and the police arrived, and basically he was totally unarmed, and they killed him. And then there's a case in Oklahoma, right, of how many was it? 5 black people were shot, 3 ended up dying. And I mean, I don't have to go on. I could go on and on and on. There have been so many examples. Yet we tend to assume that it's about the particular individuals. And what we want to know is everything about that individual case. And with that kind of myopic focus, we fail to recognize that in order to understand what happened in that place at that time, we have to have a historical understanding. We have to recognize that this is about the persistence of racism. You know, as Fanon said, wherever racism is to be found, there is a horizon of violence. And in this country, people like to assume that, oh, we finally elected our black president, so the struggle is over, right? I mean, that's what they say. What does it mean to inhabit a post-racial society anyway? But what I wanted to also suggest is that this violence has a larger context. If we attempt to recognize and apprehend the connections that link all of these examples, there are other connections to be understood as well. We inhabit a society that is saturated with violence. And the point that I want to make now is that the most consistent targets of violence in this country and in the world are women. And most of the time, we make no connections between the violence that is inflicted on a child like Trayvon Martin and the violence that is inflicted on so many women. What we think of as institutional violence and what we think of as domestic violence. And this term domestic violence, we probably should stop using it now because it has such a horrendous history. I remember early on, before the women's movement helped to transform this situation, that whenever there was violence that involved people who were intimately involved with each other and the police arrived, their response would be, oh, this is a domestic matter. This isn't a matter for the police. And it's almost as if the state and the law enforcement agencies of the state delegate to the men in the family, or those who play that role, who may not be men per se, as the perpetrators of violence. I mean, I've been thinking for a long time about the reasons why there are so many more men behind bars all over the world, and a relatively small percentage of women, 5, 6, 7% of women. And we assume it's because, oh, women aren't criminals like men are. Women don't become criminals. But that's not an answer. As a matter of fact, most of the men who are in prison aren't necessarily in because they're criminals, because there are a lot of criminals walking around who are not in prison. You know, the certain forms of criminalization and hyper-surveillance are responsible for those who are behind bars. And this is why we have such a vast number of men of color, because they live in those communities that are much more subjected to surveillance than middle-class white communities, even though they may be doing the same things, take the same drugs, selling the same drugs, but some people are being watched and others aren't. And the ones who are being watched are the ones who go to prison. And at the same time, the women's movement that challenged violence against women, and there have been vast movements all over the world over the last 4 decades. Studies have proliferated, programs have developed and expanded. Law enforcement people have received trainings about domestic violence. Programs within the prisons have developed. And there are now more perpetrators of gender violence behind bars than ever before in the history of the world. More people behind bars, mostly men, more men behind bars for gender violence. Because the response was to criminalize gender violence, to bring it into under the purview of law enforcement. However, even though more people are in prison for perpetrating gender violence than ever before, this violence continues unabated. With all of the programs we have, all of the agencies, all of the crisis centers, the hotlines. This has not reduced the number of women who are subjected to this violence. And in a sense, you might say it's not really surprising that communities that have historically suffered so many different forms of violence, from slavery to war to police violence to over-incarceration to over-punishment within the educational system, is it not surprising that girls and women in these communities suffer a disproportionate burden of intimate violence? As horrendous as it may be, should we really be surprised that family violence and intimate sexual assault continue to keep pace with the proliferation of institutional and structural violence in the world? Now, I want to go back to this idea that we tend to exceptionalize the cases about which we become aware. And this process of exceptionalization tends to make it more difficult to acknowledge the quotidian nature, the everydayness of this violence. And you may remember, was that last year, 2 years ago, when the Chris Brown, Rihanna, when was that, was it 2 years ago? And do you remember the conversations that took place around that? And also the tendency to exceptionalize it. And there were even some young women, girls, who said, oh, well, if he did that to her, she must have done something to deserve it. I mean, you probably have heard some of those responses. But I want to ask, in a culture that continues to criminalize black men and pathologize black women, is it at all surprising that violence pervades intimate relationships? The Department of Education recently released a study that indicates that black students are much more likely to be punished than white students, from kindergarten through high school. And black and Latino students constitute the overwhelming majority of those involved in school arrests or referred to law enforcement. And what was really interesting in that study was that the numbers really rise in relation to disabilities, especially the use of physical restraints against students of color with disabilities. Now, I want to move on to the question of abolition. How the prison abolitionist movement can help to create a climate that will allow us to discuss more openly gendered violence and to link it to the institutional violence, the police violence, the vigilante violence that generally targets black youth. Police violence and carceral violence, I think, have played a major role in perpetuating the violence that is reproduced within intimate relationships. And let me just tell you that the Violence Against Women Act, which was passed in 1994, there's been some discussion about it because it has to be renewed periodically, right? And the context for the Violence Against Women Act was the infamous Violent Crime and Law Enforcement Act. And so the strategy to eliminate violence against women was linked to strategies to increase law enforcement, to further render prisons more repressive in the same act. This was the same act in which prisoners lost the right to use Pell Grants for education. This was the same act that withdrew exercise equipment from prisons all over the country. It was the same act that contained a 3 strikes provision requiring the imposition of a sentence of life imprisonment for violent 3-time federal offenders. And in that act, the number of federal crimes punishable by death was increased to 60. So this was the context within which they were attempting to deal with violence against women, more violence. And law enforcement and incarceration are shortcuts when we rely on law enforcement and incarceration to solve social problems. We are shifting our focus from something that is very painful to reflect on to an expression of anger or revenge or retribution. Anger is a lot easier than sadness, than experiencing the pain of recognizing how much violence there is in the world. And rather than reflecting on what links a particular case, whether it's violence against women or it's vigilante violence, as in the case of Trayvon Martin, we want to jump immediately to the punishment. It's a kind of logic of deflection, logic of diversion. We have acquired the ideological habit of shifting our focus to punishment rather than dwelling there at the most difficult place in order really to figure out how to eliminate this violence. Not simply punishing it with more violence and thereby reproducing it in myriad ways, but seeking perhaps a long-term strategy of minimizing and eventually eliminating that violence. And this logic of diversion and deflection also enacts a process of individualization of the problem that makes it very difficult for us to stand back and reflect on the larger social context of this violence. I think of it as a kind of fast food solution. You know, we live in a society that has taught us that we get to have things immediately, instantaneously. You know, we order a hamburger, those of us who haven't become vegan yet, and we expect it in 30 seconds. And by the same token, when we think about these incidents of horrendous violence, we are so afraid to just linger, dwell there with the violence, and think about what it really means. You know, not only to the family and the community, but to all of us. And by the same token, we are afraid to think about what it might mean to eradicate violence against women and how long it might take. We want an instant solution. The instant solution is to send the person to prison. And the same thing is true when we think about homophobic violence. Rather than embarking on a process in which we all really commit to purge our institutions and our social structures and our emotions and our thoughts of homophobia, it's so much easier to send the perpetrator to prison, send the individual perpetrator to prison. Then we don't have to think about it anymore. Then we are absolved of the responsibility of really addressing the problem. Now think about the worst example of violence for most of us, and that is child sexual molestation. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to discuss it. And all of these things are considered to be secretive, right? We don't have public discussions about what it might mean to embark upon a process to eradicate our worlds of this horrendous mode of violence. And at the same time, whenever we see a sex offender, we're, without even asking questions about what the person may have done or what may have been the context, our position is that that person should be in prison for the rest of his life. And he certainly should not be living in my neighborhood. And we certainly need all of these sex offender registries, which, as Erica Miners, a wonderful scholar in education, argues, is just an extension of the prison industrial complex. And we don't stop to think that usually when people commit these horrible acts, it is often because something really horrible was done to them. I attended a group of meetings at a women's detention facility in my neighborhood in Richmond. I live in Oakland. And there was a woman who said, one of the prisoners there, and she said, I am in this institution because I was made to suffer so much pain. And horrible things were done to me, she said. And she said, and no one told me what to do with that pain. She said, had I known how to handle that pain, what to do with it, I would probably be in a university now and not in this prison. Now, feminist scholars have pointed out, of course, that one of the most dangerous venues in our society is the family, the heteropatriarchal family. The family is what philosopher Louis Althusser called an ideological state apparatus. And since we're talking about violence, we can say that the family serves as a major site for the reproduction of violence and for the social reproduction of an exploitative system. The family often recapitulates the violence of the larger society. The heteropatriarchal family is inconceivable without its role as a haven for violence against women and against children. And what's interesting, and this is a point that Erica Minus makes, is that in the sex offender registries, there's a striking exception, those who don't get put on the sex offender registries. And I'll tell you who they are. In other places I've asked, who do you think doesn't get to go on sex offender registers? People say priests, they say police, they say, all kinds of answers, but they have never been able to recognize that it is perpetrators of incest who are never on sex offender registries. As if that's something more normal and more natural. Now, focusing on criminalization, on the other hand, and incarceration, prevents us from recognizing that the danger of violence is usually closer to us than we ever want to acknowledge. And despite the fact that we should know differently, criminalization has the effect of estrangement. That is to say, even though we may be experiencing directly or indirectly violence that is close to us in our families, we tend to see the perpetrators of violence as a stranger danger. In the U.S., 3.3 million children witness domestic violence every year. And because my timer is going to go off any moment, I want to make sure, as we reflect on the ways in which the abolition of imprisonment as the dominant mode of punishment can help us to focus on the larger context of violence and to recognize that solutions, that imprisonment brings no solutions. As a matter of fact, it's often a part of the problem. It's a part of the reproduction of the problem that we presume to address by locking people away in prison. One of the many people who's currently locked away in prison is Mumia Abu-Jamal. And I wanted to share with you the fact that April 24th, which is next Tuesday, is Mumia's 58th birthday. Did any of you get these cards? People, you didn't get the cards? Do you know about the Occupy action that's happening next Tuesday at the Justice Department? Oh, I say, are you passing them out? Oh, okay, good. Well, I just wanted to tell you that a broad coalition of groups are throwing Mumia a party. Yeah. And of course, when we look at the fact that he has been in prison for decades as a result of the kind of police racism that we've been talking about this evening, you might be interested in participating in this Occupy the Department of Justice action to call for Mumia Abu-Jamal's release and for an end to mass incarceration. This action follows a call made by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who on December 9th called on the U.S. government to rise to the challenge of reconciliation, human rights, and justice, and he called for the immediate release of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And I'll tell you that Danny Glover is going to be there, M1 of Dead Prez will be there, a bunch of people. And I want to be there, but I had committed to doing a keynote address at a conference for Manning Marable, who I understand graduated from this institution as an undergraduate, or did he get his PhD? He got his PhD in history here, and he just received the Pulitzer Prize posthumously for his book on Malcolm X. And I'm sure if Manning were alive, he would be in Washington as well. The demands of this April 24th action are release Mumia Abu-Jamal, end mass incarceration and the criminalization of Black and Latino youth. We want schools, jobs, health care, not jails. An end to the racist death penalty, an end to solitary confinement and torture, hands off immigrants, and free all political prisoners. So the action will include a request to Eric Holder that he meet with a delegation to discuss this crisis of criminalization and mass incarceration. And Julian Bond will be a part of the delegation to meet with Mr. Holder. Now, everyone's familiar with Mumia's case, right? Yes? Is there anyone who doesn't know about this case? Okay, Have you ever heard his name? You've heard his name. Some of you haven't even heard his name. Well, I can tell you that there are streets named after him in France and in Germany. And Mumia became the first person to be declared an honorary citizen of Paris after Pablo Picasso many, many, many years ago. The only reason why it has not been possible to build the kind of vast movement that we need to free him is because of the power of the police. And the police all over the country have, and I'm not saying that every single individual policeman or woman, because there are people who do that work, who are conscious and who are anti-racist, and who are also targets of racism within their own police departments. So, speaking out on behalf of Mumia Abu-Jamal is to speak out against the prison industrial complex and against this criminalization process we've been talking about this evening. And let me say that, finally, the context of prison abolition, and some of you may have questions, what does it mean to abolish prisons? So what kind of justice system would we have? And these are all really good questions. But let me say that the most important element of this discussion about the abolition of prisons is the interconnectedness of this process with all of the other institutions in our society. Many of us who have never been to prison, jail or prison, at least have never been there as a prisoner, assume that we are somehow unconnected, unrelated to this crisis of over-incarceration. And we often think of it, if we get involved in it, as being over there somewhere. But we have all been deeply affected by the soaring prison populations and the centrality of the institution of the prison. And as I said before, ideologically, our thoughts and our emotions have been shaped by this institution to the extent that most of us cannot even imagine living in a world where prisons don't exist. It produces fear, whereas we should really be afraid of the military. We should be afraid of the big bankers. There are a lot of things we should be afraid of, but we're able to focus that fear on those who are demonized and criminalized by either putting them in prison or treating them as always already criminalized. And this is the thing about young black men, especially young black men. They are treated as if they are worthy only of an institution like the prison. The prison abolition movement, it seems to me, offers us a really dramatic way of continuing the struggle for freedom in the 21st century. The abolitionist movement in the 19th century against slavery, the abolitionist movement in the 20th century against the vestiges of slavery, what we call the civil rights movement, right? The abolitionist movement in the 21st century against the death penalty and against prisons which recapitulate the processes of slavery. And so imagining and struggling for a world whose landscape is not crowded by prisons and other carceral institutions is to imagine and struggle for a world without violence against black boys, without intimate violence, and without state violence. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You've given us much to think about. I am Sherry Parks from the American Studies Department, and we are going to run to 8:45 because we are sure that you have questions. There are only 2 rules, but they will be enforced by me. If we are live streaming, as you know, so you can't just stand up and talk. You have to come to one of the 2 mics. One right there, one right there. So make your way. And think before you ask your question, because we will entertain succinct, well-formed questions. There's only 1 lecture tonight. It has been given. And that way we can get in as many as possible. Are you?
Thank you very much. Professor Davis, first of all, please pardon any presumptuousness in the note that I left you, but there's little that I will not do in order to work to improve relations with Cuba and to defend freedom of the Cuban Five. And I know that you've spoken about the Cuban Five, and if you could say a few words about their case and also allow me to announce and pass out cards about activities, including a lecture on Friday night with Danny Glover and Dolores Huerta, I would really appreciate it. And thank you for your struggle.
So where is the lecture?
I have cards.
Okay, give me the card. Okay. Friday, April 20th at the Festival Center. The Festival Center? Is that the Festival Center?
The Festival Center.
Yes. And yes, do you know about the case of the Cuban Five? Yes. Okay, one of the demands of the action at the Justice Department is to free all political prisoners. There are many political prisoners in this country, including the Cuban Five, who are Cuban citizens who were actually attempting to prevent acts of terror against Cuba, who were then arrested and charged with terrorism. I mean, this is the way things go in this country, and we need, again, a vast movement to free these men who are defending the Cuban Revolution. And I don't know how many of you have ever visited Cuba, or what you know about Cuba, or what you know about the Cuban educational system, or perhaps you know something about the Cuban healthcare system. Those of us who are abolitionists argue that the real alternatives to prison should be health care and education. And Cuba provides us with an example. Cuba provides us with an example of what is possible if health care is truly accessible. And let me say that there's also a program whereby Cuban medical schools train people who commit to serving poor communities all over the world. And there are quite a few people from the U.S. who couldn't afford to get an education, who couldn't afford to attend medical school here because education is a commodity. And they've gone to Cuba, they've been educated, and they return and they work in poor communities, on reservations, in black communities, etc. So, free the Cuban Five. Thank you very much for raising that.
Hello, Dr. Davis. Thank you so much for speaking tonight. Every time I get to see you, I feel incredibly honored and humbled because, as I like to tell people often, I aspire to be a combination of you and Erykah Badu when I grow up. And I think I'm on a decent path. I work at this really small, amazing grassroots nonprofit called the Washington Peace Center that tries to be a movement-building organization. So yesterday was tax day, and there were like 6 different major actions that people were organizing, and my coworker Sonia and I are trying really hard to get people to work together and be more effective in this work to build a unified movement for social change.
Is there a question?
This is exhausting. Yeah, it is absolutely exhausting. And Sonia and I were just talking about how we wanted to ask you today, how do you continue? How is it that you do self-care? What advice do you have for activists in the audience and even students who are working really hard to do their work sustainably for the long term rather than just burning out and exiting the movement?
Well, thank you for the work that you're doing. Continue. My sense has always been that when one makes a commitment to attempt to transform the world, however one does it, it should be a lasting commitment. And therefore, one should not force oneself to do things that bring no pleasure. One should see the process of doing this work as a source of joy. And it is also not only about this individual, but about my relations with other people and future relations. And when people ask me that question, how do I continue? Where do I find the strength? I don't really have an answer because I can't imagine my life any other way. So it's not that I've felt drawn to do anything else. To do this work in different ways. And I think people have to discover what is most passionate, what their passions are. If you are an artist, you're probably not going to do well as an administrator, of a movement organization. Yeah. So use your art to do that work. Some people have amazing administrative skills and love it. Do that. But always think of it as, not so much as something that something that is outside of your life, something that you can do or not do. But think of it as the way in which you connect with human beings and non-human beings and all of those who populate this planet today, tomorrow, and well into the future.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is LaFonda Willis, and I have a very strong interest, actually a passion for incarcerated women and girls. And I wanted to ask you, until prisons are completely abolished, what policy changes do you think that we can implement to really achieve fair and equitable outcomes for incarcerated women and girls?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, because oftentimes people assume that when you say you're a prison abolitionist, it means that you don't want to do anything to help people who are compelled to live a portion of their lives, or sometimes all of their lives, behind bars. And so, yes, there are so many things to be done. I work with an organization called Sisters Inside, which is an organization around women in prison that is headquartered in Queensland, Australia. It's an amazing organization. One of the things I think that whether we work with men or women behind bars, we have to recognize is that we will have to overcome that tendency to be missionaries. Because those hierarchies that assert themselves cause us to think of ourselves as somehow superior because we inhabit the free world. And those who are behind bars, and women especially, are poor, pitiful beings. As opposed to that kind of hierarchization of the relations, think of people with whom you work who are behind bars as egalitarian, as partners in an egalitarian process. And so much of what we know about how to do this work against the prison industrial complex has come from prisoners, including from women prisoners. Think about strategies that allow people who are in prison to assert leadership as well, even if they're not able to come outside. There are ways in which you can create communication so that they participate in the process. And rather than deciding what women need, ask them what they think they need. And let me just tell you a story, and I'm trying not to be long-winded because there are a lot of people in line. But not long ago, there was this gender-responsive process that, you remember Governor Schwarzenegger? Under Schwarzenegger in California. He wanted to institute this gender-responsive process which would close down one of the women's prisons. There are two enormous maximum security prisons in Chowchilla, California, the two largest women's prisons in the entire world. They're right across the street from each other. And so he was going to close one down so that the men who are in overcrowded situations, I mean, the women are in overcrowded situations as well, but the federal court had issued an injunction against Schwarzenegger requiring him to release a number of men prisoners. So what he wanted to do was to put the men in the women's prison, and then he wanted to put the women in small, private, community-based prisons. Private. Somebody was going to be making money off of that, right? And so the women inside the prison circulated a petition and got something like 3,000 signatures, some amazing number of signatures from the women inside who spoke out against this so-called gender-responsive strategy. And it was only because they knew that this was yet another excuse to further expand the prison system. And for them to make that argument, they had to overcome the proclivity to think about what would be best for them individually. Because it might have been more comfortable for them to be in a place, a smaller place, a place that was nearer their home. So I think the best solution is to work together with women who are incarcerated and come up with the strategies collectively in that way.
Hi, I just wanted to, first things first, my friend Eric sends you his best. He told me to tell you that. My friend Eric, he saw you at Occupy, I think, or something like that. He just told me to tell you, he said hi.
Okay.
And basically, first, I just wanted to thank you for what you said about, black men or black people are most arrested because they're most under surveillance, because it helped me think about something that takes place actually at University of Maryland, and with I guess social functions and that African American groups throw, like parties and whatnot. Often there's security and there's security checkpoints that we go through. But recently I was talking to one of my friends, and she's a executive board member of the Indian Student Association, and she told me at her parties, they don't have security checkpoints. What does that mean? She doesn't understand. And there's always that expectation of, I guess, minority students, particularly, I guess, for me, for black students, there was that expectation that you're going to slip up, you're going to mess up, and we need to watch you. So I just wanted to ask you, what steps can we take as students to free ourselves from that institutional mindset?
Well, that's a really great question, because you are pointing to the fact that we are all implicated in these processes. We sometimes tend to think of them as happening over there, but we assent to them. We are also responsible for their continuation and perpetuation. The thing to do is to get a movement going. And you're talking about the University of Maryland?
Yes.
And of course there would be, where are we? But you see, I think it would be important for not just black people to protest against the imposition of security for black events, but to get a really diverse group, a mass of people to protest and say no. And at the same time, I think it's important to recognize the connections between security at an event on a campus and the kind of security state that we live under. The Islamophobia, that is very much a motor of that security state. And let me just say parenthetically that I recently visited Palestine. And talking about checkpoints and security. I mean, Palestine is the largest open-air prison in the world. And I think it would be important to make that connection. I'm talking about some of the connections I think we should make in understanding violence, but we should make global connections as well. And I think especially for black people, we need to assert a solidarity with the Palestinian people. And I say especially for black people because Palestinian activists are using many of the strategies that were historically used in the black liberation movement. And I'll just tell you this one story, because I could go on and on talking about Palestine. But when I was in jail myself, and I was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and people smile about that now. They didn't used to smile about it. It's like, but anyway, while I was in jail, I got messages of solidarity from people everywhere, all over the world, including from prisoners all over the world. And I remember getting a message from Palestinian political prisoners in 1971. And when I went to Palestine this past summer, I met a man who told me that he was one of the political prisoners who signed that solidarity statement. And it was so incredible to be able to embrace him in the so-called free world, less free than we think. And to make those connections between something that seems to be relatively minor, although it's not minor, it's a part of the surveillance, it's a part of the security state, it's a part of the kind of security that has been encouraged by the so-called war on terror. To make those connections, think about it in a broad context, and invite allies to participate in the struggle to eliminate it.
Hi, my name's Enrique. I'm I'm a graduate student in the history department. I was just wondering, I had kind of a big picture question, and I was wondering what, I think that, with the election of Obama, I think a lot of people were voicing their frustration with, I think, the status quo, and but not much has changed, I think 1 in 4 black men are in prison, I believe. Latinos are around 25%, males are in prison as well. Wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, right? Venezuela, re-signed the embargo against Cuba, Obama did. How do you see, what is your idea about changing things? I mean, do you participate in the system, or is that just solidifying?
Okay, I think I understand what you're asking me. Okay. This is a complicated question because, I mean, you're absolutely right that there's a whole range of issues that we have to address. But I want to say this. These elections are coming up. And I don't want Mitt Romney to be president. And however critical we are of Obama, and we can be very, very critical, I think we should claim the victory that led to his election. He didn't get elected because he was Barack Obama. He got elected because people all over this country, young people especially, joined that campaign. And obviously because they were both seduced by the idea of hope for the future, and we often also ended up projecting our hopes on this one man. Even those of us who were revolutionaries, we think we are, we got caught up in it, and it was a wonderful thing. It was an incredible moment. And let's not forget that moment. Let's not forget that world historical moment when people all over the world joined us as we celebrated the election of Barack Obama. Now, we voted him into office, the office of the presidency of the United States. So what did you think we were doing? I mean, was he supposed to be some kind of messiah who was going to lead us to freedom? I mean, all we were doing was electing him to the office of the presidency of the United States. And that didn't change the country. It didn't change the institutions. It didn't change the military. But some things did change. Some things did change. And I think that if we are really serious about activism, we have to take responsibility for the victories we do achieve. And we do have to recognize the difference. You see, we can be good feminists, all of us, by realizing that we can both be critical, be very critical of Obama, and also acknowledge that some things have changed. I don't think we would have this kind of massive sentiment around Trayvon Martin under George Bush. I don't think the Occupy movement would have emerged as it did. And in a sense, you can say that was the movement that could have happened right after Inauguration Day. And had it emerged then, it didn't, of course, but had it emerged then, perhaps we would have been able to put more pressure on Obama to compel him to do more than he's actually done. But I think that that in a sense we were involved in that campaign for ourselves. And I have to confess that that was the very first time I ever voted for, I vote all the time. But it's the very first time I ever voted for a candidate of a major party. I always vote communist or green or peace and freedom or something like that. It was the first time in my entire life. But the thing is, we didn't say we won. We said he won. Had we said we won, perhaps we would have recognized that we needed to win many more victories. That we couldn't just say, okay, now it's your turn, Barack. Realize all of our hopes and dreams. We would have stayed together and we would have put more pressure on him. We would have forced the closure of Guantanamo Bay a long time ago. We would have prevented the troops from going into Afghanistan. we would have guaranteed that we had a better health care program than the one that's under attack right now. So my sense is that we really need to get involved in the elections this time around. And we have to do it for ourselves. We have to be clear about who we're doing it for. It's not simply to elect somebody to the presidency, but to build the kind of movement that is really going to move towards transforming this country.
And I'm sorry to all the people who are lined up, but we have run out of time and run over. I'm sorry. I'm the bad one. But thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much.